With over 1,400 years since inception and tallying almost 2 billion current followers, the Islamic religion has been a major influential force for generations. The history of their faith is fascinating and is crucial to our understanding of the world. For a long time in the U.S., Islam has been politicized and weaponized. However, we recognize that the Muslim population are people created in God's image, in need of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and in need of repentance and salvation. The local body of Christ must be equipped to engage with Muslims. We will provide practical ways to have conversations and build relationships in the following videos. These relationship-strengthening conversational pieces and the spirit-filled love of Christ will be the lifeblood of our outreach. As you walk through this series, we desire that you develop a passion for Muslims and a passion for sharing the gospel with people that live in our cities and in our communities that need Christ desperately, just like you and I.
To understand the rise of Islam, you really need to understand a little bit about the world then, because the world back in the 7th century was not the same as the world today. And so when you're trying to understand anything in history, you've always got to think about the context of what the world was like. And to be honest with you, the Mediterranean world in the 7th century was a lot like the Wild West, think in early America. It was a wild place. There was no real central authority, a lot of shifting political alliances. We think today about borders and modern nation states, and there wasn't any of that. There was whoever took over was now in charge, and that was the world that gave rise to Islam. So in all the shifting, so all the warring, what had been ignored for a long time was this tract of land. If you think about where Africa is and you go east, you have the Arabian Peninsula, which today, that's Saudi Arabia, right? And this was a tract of land, a pretty large one, that had been ignored during all the clamoring and fighting for land during that time in history. And in the early 600s, the 7th century, that is when an Arab merchant by the name of Muhammad claimed that he was visited by the angel Gabriel, which is really interesting because we don't know that there was any real established Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula at that time. We know there were Christians. There were also communities of Jews, and yet here this merchant says, I have received a vision from the angel Gabriel, and he has given me not a new religion, he was claiming, but the culmination of these prior religions, the culmination of Judaism, the culmination of Christianity. And what he said he received from the angel was that there was one God whose name was Allah, and that this God was righteous and just, that He rules all things and demands obedience from all. And Jesus was one of His prophets, not divine, but one of His prophets. And He begins teaching this, and He's teaching this in a city called Mecca. And the problem is that people in the city of Mecca aren't happy about this new teaching, because the people in power in the city of Mecca made a lot of money on polytheistic religions. And so here is Muhammad claiming that there's only one God, and they don't like it, and they run him out of town. And so Muhammad leaves town in 622. He settles in a place called Medina, and it's there that he starts the first Muslim community, a whole city, a community of people that he has now brought under this new religion. And they are now living underneath the law with the worship and politics and their civil society brought underneath Allah's rule. And once they're strengthened, they go back to Mecca and they conquer it and they take it over. And Muhammad says that he will forgive the people who drove him out if they will forsake their idols and join his community. And so by the time of 632, so just 10 years later, in 10 years, Muhammad and his new religion of Islam has conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula. and he dies in that year, 632. By the time he dies, all of that land is brought under Muslim rule, and his followers then begin driving east, and they begin going through Syria, Damascus. In 638, they take over Jerusalem, North Africa, Spain, and building followers as they go until that whole region is now dominated by Islam. Now, interestingly, they allowed Christians and Jews, they granted them some measure of toleration. If they were willing to pay a tax to the Muslim rulers, they could remain quietly going by their own religion, by their own faith. Sometimes that didn't happen. Sometimes they forced conversion at the edge of a sword. A good summary of Islam is to look at what they call their 5 pillars. And that's, you think about a pillar as what upholds a structure. The 5 pillars are the 5 things that uphold the entire system of their faith. The first one is that all Muslims believe that Allah is God. There's only one God. His name is Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Second, they believe in prayer. Muslims pray 5 times per day. They believe, third, in charity, that you should help the poor, for example. Fourth, they believe in the pilgrimage. Every Muslim is required to take a pilgrimage to Mecca, the city of Muhammad, at least once in their life, unless they're hindered by disability. And then fifth, they believe in fasting. You may have heard of Ramadan, which is the month that they devote to fasting. Muslims believe in Sharia law, which is where they believe that God, Allah, has revealed everything that we're supposed to do, including, so his law is not just pertaining to worship, but his law also pertains to politics, to how to order and structure a society. And so there's no concept of separation of church and state. It all is supposed to come underneath his authority. They worship on Fridays in a mosque. They don't eat pork. They're not supposed to drink alcohol. Basically, if you follow the law of Allah, you're saved. You're his people. And that is a good summary of the basics of what they believe. It's important to remember that as Islam shifted west from the Arabian Peninsula through the Mediterranean world, that the lands that it's conquering are Christian lands. These are places that the church had a strong foothold before. And so there's a huge impact that's going to happen in terms of the impact of Islam on Christianity, particularly in places like North Africa. If you read the early church, there are many major theologians who came from North Africa. You may have heard of Augustine. He was North African. So North Africa, at the beginning of the church, was a huge, important piece of land for the church and had a huge impact on the church. Well, once Islam sweeps through that region, the church pretty much just disappears. I mean, even today, you'd be hard-pressed to find influential Christian movements in those lands. And so you see immediately there's conflict between Christianity and Islam. The center of gravity sort of shifts for Christianity at this point, because everything to the east, you think of Constantinople, which today is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. Constantinople was has a huge role in the history of the church, and the Eastern Church in particular. Well, that whole region up through the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, all the way to Italy is now Muslim lands. And Christianity ends up going from think about the boot of Italy up through France, up through Britain. That becomes the sort of strip where the center of Christianity is shifted to. The beginning of the Quran is very pro-Christianity, actually. It's clear that Muhammad initially wanted Islam to appeal, to be accepted by Christians and Jews. He wanted them to see him and recognize him as a legitimate prophet. And so he calls Christians and Jews fellow people of the book. We are all people of the book. He he defines Islam as the continuation of Judaism and Christianity, and now Islam, in fact, the culmination of those things, but the Christians don't receive him. And that becomes the problem, and that's where the conflict begins. They do not accept his teachings, and so you begin to see the tone change even within the Quran. The Quran begins to critique Christianity. And one of the main things that the Quran critiques is the concept of the Trinity, which interestingly, when the Quran talks about the Trinity, it gets it wrong. Muhammad mistakenly thought that the Trinity referred to the Father, the Son, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. But Muhammad in the Quran critiques the Trinity and says that's polytheistic. That's many gods, not one God. He also says that Jesus is only a man. He denies the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. As it goes on in the narrative, Christians are no longer fellow people of the book or potential believers even, but Christians are evil and they must not even be befriended by Muslims. And all of that is because of the reception that he receives from Christians when he first launches out in this new faith. You know, when you think about the relationship between Islam and Christianity, most people immediately go to the Crusades, and that's a natural place to go. The Crusades, however, do not begin until 400 years after Muhammad begins Islam. So in 1095, the Pope at the time, Urban II, he preaches a sermon. And remember that at this time, Jerusalem, just like most of the Mediterranean world, is under Islamic rule. And the Pope Urban preaches a sermon where he calls Christians to go take back the Holy Land from the Muslims. And Christians take this message and they interpret it as a call to holy war. They're reading Revelation and they're applying the war imagery of Revelation to this physical earthly war that they're going to undertake. That the struggle between good and evil in the heavens is taking place on the human realm. God is going to work His divine will through these physical armies, and all of this apocalyptic imagery is used to describe what is happening there. And in 1099, Jerusalem falls to the Christian invaders now, and they drive the Muslims out. And if you read the scenes, though, it is horrific. There are children and women slaughtered by the Christian armies during the Crusades. There are Jews that were in Jerusalem, and they're killed too. There will eventually be 4 crusades, different movements of Christian armies that are going in to take back these lands from the Muslim invaders. And obviously that violence is going to shape the way Muslims and Christians treat one another. And I say all that not to put all the violence on one side. Obviously the Muslims were violent as well, but there's wars being fought, and a lot of the friction that's still around today, you can trace it all the way back to that initial violence. And before we go, I mean, there's a few things that we all need to remember. And the first thing that I want to just remind everyone is that Muslim is a follower of Islam, and that is not synonymous with an Arab. I think sometimes we think that's the same thing. When we say that someone is Arabic, what we mean is that that's someone who speaks a certain language. That's someone who has roots from Arabia, from the Arabic Peninsula. There can be someone who's an Arab who's also a Christian. And so those two things aren't synonymous. I think that's important to remember. I think another thing that's important to remember is that there are different Islams. Throughout this whole history and all of this stuff that's happening, there are sects arising. There are differences in theology within Islam that still persist today. And so that's still a reality today. And the other thing I would like to say is that it's important to remember that most Muslims are not the terrorists that you read about on that you read about in history books or see images of on the news at night. Most Muslims that you're going to meet are kind and hospitable people who need Jesus Christ. And it's important as the church that we remember that.